I basically have three different sort of legal questions for you here. And I want to start with Meadows and this contempt charge. And what you think the conversation's going to be like at Justice about whether to do this one and how different it is in your mind from the decision to charge Steve Bannon.
Well, I hope I have three answers for you, Chuck, if you have three questions. But first,
you got it.
Meadows. I think this is a much more difficult case than the contempt case against Steve Bannon. Let me explain why. Bannon just refused to cooperate at all. He just snubbed the committee and walked away. Meadows not only negotiated with the committee, but provided thousands of documents to the committee. And where he refused to cooperate, it was based on his invocation of whatever residual executive privilege remains in former President Trump. Now, based on my reading of the law, I don't think there is any valid residual executive privilege that Trump possesses, but the courts have not fully resolved that issue. And so it strikes me that Meadows can do two things. He can cooperate to some extent, provide documents, and maintain that there are certain questions he can answer. And those two facts, I think, make it much more difficult for the Department of Justice to file criminal charges against him. Much more difficult.
Chuck, what are the rules that the January 6th committee has to abide by right now in dealing with Mark Meadows' texts? And the reason I say is, right now they have what he clearly gave them some texts, and they decided, hey, this is what he gave us, so we're going to read them. Other people have given information where it appears to me it shows they texted Meadows, but they don't have those Meadows texts, right, which may have led to these subpoenas. Is there any reason they can't use that evidence themselves, or do they have to wait to clear up this ip of executive privilege?
Well, good questions, Chuck. So one observation I have, I think it's unfortunate that the committee is sort of exposing these text messages as it suits them in public, rather than simply compiling information for its report. You know, when the 9/11 Commission did its work, of course, it held public hearings, but really, in terms of seeing what it gathered, all the information and evidence that it obtained, we had to wait to read its report, and it was an extraordinarily compelling, and by the way, bipartisan support. So I wish Congress wasn't doing this. I wish the committee was simply collecting and analyzing and not piecemeal dropping parts of evidence into the public record right now. But you do raise a good question about executive privilege. And so it's hard to know what we don't know. It's hard to know what they don't have. It's hard to know what they're trying to get and where they might be running into some legal impediment. But that said, I really wish the committee would do its work more quietly. I think it would make its report in the end more compelling.
What legal jeopardy does Mark Meadows have for not turning over certain records to the National Archives? Is there a crime? Is this a criminal act or a civil or a civil disobedience here? Yeah,
another really good question, Chuck. So I think you're referring to the Presidential Records Act, which you find in Title 4. My read of it is that there's no enforcement mechanism. When it was passed by Congress in 1978 in wake of Watergate and concerns over the destruction of records by Richard Nixon and those around him, what Congress did is rely that presidents would act in good faith. In other words, presidents would make determinations about what records needed to go to the archives for historical purposes, and they would preserve and protect their records, and members of their senior staff would do the same thing. So it's possible, theoretically, that if someone is destroying records, they could incur some other charge, maybe an obstruction of justice, if there's an ongoing investigation. But the Presidential Records Act itself doesn't contain an enforcement mechanism. There is no criminal penalty for failing to abide by it. We believe that presidents and senior staff will act in good faith. When they don't, you see the problem that it generates.
Donald Trump introduced the act, has, to me, waylaid the idea that the expectation that people will act in good faith. I think this should be the final piece of evidence that when you pass a law like that, you better have an enforcement mechanism, because Donald Trump has proven if you don't have one, you can literally blow right through the law. Final question here is, Benny Thompson has been very careful whenever he's asked about subpoenaing certain members of Congress, whether it's Kevin McCarthy, Paul Gosar. How complicated is that for that committee?
Yeah, so I think it's politically complicated because, the tables always turn. Some other, other parties trade off running the House, running the Senate, running the White House. And so you'd want to be careful about setting political precedents for subpoenaing other members of Congress. My hope, and this is sort of like Charlie Brown, Lucy, and the football, and my hopes are often dashed, is that members of Congress would want to simply cooperate because they're members of this body and they would want to help get to the right answer, right? I mean, I know, yeah, right, foolish, I know, naive, I understand. But I don't know that there's a legal impediment to subpoenaing other members of Congress, but there may be a political one, Chuck.